The Atheist-based Patreon project presents Why People Are Leaving Christianity. Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I came across an article through a friend of a friend that was posted December 13th of 2022 on baptistnews.com called, I Asked People Why They're Leaving Christianity, and Here's What I Heard. And from this, I got a number of good pieces of information, but I want to talk a little bit about this because while the author of this article had some interesting insights, which I'll share with you, I have some thoughts of my own as well. He starts off by mentioning a September 2022 Pew study that showed that those people in the United States that identify as Christian fell from in 1972, 90% of people surveyed identified as Christian, and in 2020 it was down to 64%. And there's been a lot of discussion about this mass exodus. A lot of us have referenced the nuns, the N-O-N-Es, the people who say nun when asked what their religion is, and how that group is rising and increasing. Now, I will point out that when you look at a study from 1972 and compare it to, or a survey from 72 and compare it to a survey from 2020, the statistics are at least questionable, even for a well-done poll from a reputable source. And the reason they're questionable is the same reason that studies about what percentage of the population is gay or trans are questionable. If you live in a place and a time where being queer is a crime or dangerous or comes at significant risk, you are less likely to say you're queer, even if you're on an anonymous survey. Similarly, there may have been fewer people identifying as non-Christians in 1972, as some folks may have been afraid to say they weren't Christian, or it just didn't occur to them that that was really an answer. A lot of people, if everybody around you is a Christian, your whole family's a Christian, and you're involved in, surveys and stuff, you just defaulted to saying you were a Christian no matter what you really believed. And who knows what is a true Christian? I don't get to define it. I can tell you, what it was like being a Southern Baptist. I can tell you what different denominations believe, and that there's disagreement on virtually everything. But I'll let the theists argue over who qualifies as a real Christian, because I guarantee you a good chunk of the people who have been involved in a deconstruction of their Christian beliefs and have found their way out are just going to be dismissed as not true believers. And people will point to actual verses in the Bible to justify this. And I'll get to that in a little bit. I want to point out that the survey that he did, and this is Brandon Flannery, who is a gay ex-pastor and author of at least of articles for various news sites. He acknowledges, and I want to point out, this is not a statistically reliable survey. This is not a nationwide random sampling. This is some surveys that he did on social media. And so while he got 1,200 respondents, the likelihood is that they're going to be biased, as they're people who found his survey, which means they may be of people who follow him and his writing and everything else. That doesn't mean this is useless. What I would suggest is that we need some of the similar questions, or questions similar to the ones that he asked, should be directed to people on a more random sampling survey to find out, what are people really thinking across the board? So he already acknowledges this isn't going to be a reliable scientific framework and that the results may be biased. But he asked a handful of questions. And the first one was, what existential framework were you raised in? And this is basically, what was your starting point in religion? Was it Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism, etc.? What existential framework do you currently find yourself in after this deconstruction process? What initiated the change, or what was the first instance where things began to change in your mind? What was the final reason that made you give up the denomination or group that you were part of? The straw that broke the camel's back is how he lists it. And then two follow-up questions, which I found really interesting. What does your current existential framework offer you that your previous one did not? And what does your current existential framework not offer you that your previous one did? There's some incredibly interesting thoughts going just surrounding this because it tells so much about how people genuinely think and feel about their religion. Now, we're going to go through the answers, and he's got nice graphs and has done loads and loads of work here. So huge thank you to Brandon, and apologies if he doesn't like the conclusions that I reached based on this. But on the previous existential framework, 61.5% of them were Protestant, 15.5% were unspecified, 11.6% were Catholic, 10.6% were LDS, and the remainder were Anglican, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. And I'll mention that while he got 1,200 responses, he removed everyone who didn't start as some type of Christian. So anybody who was Hindu or Buddhist or whatever got stripped out of this survey because he's specifically looking at people who are deconstructing from some version of Christianity. And after doing that, that left him with still over 1,000 responses, 1,050 responses. And so of those 1,050, here's the existential framework that they're in, or that they began in. Then you take a look at what their current position is. So of those 1,000 plus responses, 31.2% are agnostic, 18.6% are atheist, 10.2% are unknown, 7.3% are some unspecified version of Christianity, 7% fit into other, 7% are pagan, and then you get spiritualism and Protestant Christianity and none and other in a mix and all those things. It's interesting because the 31.2 and 18.6%, I don't tend to make a distinction between atheist and agnostic in polls like this. I understand that there's a lot of confusion around the terms. I've done videos on it. I've done lectures on it. I've answered the question hundreds of times on the various live shows. And I don't think there's a useful distinction when we're talking about, hey, are you part of a religion? No. To me, both the agnostic and the atheist category are clearly nuns, the N-O-N-E nuns, secularists, you might say. And so that's almost 50% of the 1,000 respondents who began as Protestant, Catholic, LDS, some other version of Christianity. 50% of those are now atheist agnostic. That's 500-ish of the 1,050 respondents. That's a big deal. And I know that some people want to make a significant distinction out of agnosticism or atheism. And I find that most of the time that's an attempt to avoid identifying as an atheist or lending any credence to an atheist position or confusion about an atheist position, where you think atheists are people who are absolutely sure there's no God and agnostics just aren't convinced. And the truth is they answer different questions, because theism and atheism address belief, and Gnosticism and agnosticism address knowledge, and knowledge is a subset of belief, and so you can be an agnostic theist. Agnostic atheist gets more difficult, but we'll skip all of that because that's not the purpose of this. I'm not looking at this study going, look, we got half of all the people who are leaving are becoming secularists. That's not really why I'm doing it. I just like pointing it out. At the end of the day, there are plenty of people who left one version of Christianity for another, at least, 7% or so, and possibly some others. The 4 remaining questions started with things like, what was your initial reason for leaving? And this is where the author of this article chose to mostly focus, because it's important. Hey, why are people leaving Christianity of some stripe or another? And it turns out that 21.7% cited LGBTQ rights issues and treatment essentially as the reason that they left their church. I want to make sure that there's a distinction here. Since not all of them left Christianity, this is the reason they left whatever version of Christianity they were in before, wherever they happen to end up. The number one reason, at a little over 21%, was LGBTQ issues. Then there was 16%? The behavior of believers, so just didn't like the people in the church. Then at 12% is intellectual integrity. Below that is exposure to difference at 11%. Then faith leadership, education, Politics, women's rights, pain and evil, scriptural issues was at 4%, as was independence and afterlife and feelings. Unanswered prayer came in at 3%. Purity culture, mental health, us versus them, civil rights, all of those things were down at 3%. Abuse and hiding abuse, the scandals of churches, religious institutions, not only hiding child assaulters, child rapists from prosecution, but the scandal surrounding that was still only like 2.5%. Lack of relevance, theological issues, moral misalignment, and then church history was 1.3%. And it's almost like people were like, "Oh, the child abuse scandal, that's on par with church history." Well, the church has a pretty gruesome and bloody history, but I could understand why there are very few people leaving because of the Salem witch trials or any number of the Inquisition, things like that. We don't have to go back to antiquity to find reasons to leave. That was people's initial reason. That was the thing that made them say, "Hang on a second, maybe I don't have a good reason for believing this." But there's a slight change here between what their initial reasons for leaving were and what their final reasons for leaving were. Now, the number of people who finally left over LGBTQ issues increased from 21% or so to 24%. Behavior believers was still in second, but politics jumped from 7th to 3rd. And I'll just read you from the article. Brandon wrote, "For many respondents, politics is what finally motivated them to leave Christianity. Specifically, many referenced the election of Donald Trump and the support he received from the evangelical community. In fact, the name Trump was mentioned 81 times in the survey as a key reason someone left Christianity. For example, these are some of the respondents' experiences. Quote, a culmination of events over the course of a few months starting in the summer of 2020. I had a fight with my father-in-law over the Confederate flag being a symbol of racism. He stopped speaking to me for months and it became a whole thing. The rise in glorifying Trump and fascism disguised as democracy." There's other quotes in the article as well. One of them was the 2016 election. "I wanted nothing to do with a group that supported Trump and his insane ideology under the pretenses of faith." This was a lot. But when you look at the final reasons for leaving, while politics jumped up and faith leadership moved up a little bit, intellectual integrity dropped from 12% to 7% because other things got a boost. But when you look at this list, you have women's rights stayed about the same at about 6%. Scriptural issues, civil rights, abuse and hiding abuse still, that was like at 4%. So it jumped up a little bit. It's like once something made people start questioning, once something made them think, hang on a minute, I'm involved in a church here and I'm not necessarily agreeing with what they're saying, or I'm having difficulty with this, that caused them to look into other issues and find other reasons. The follow-up from this is to think, okay, what is gained by leaving and what is lost by leaving? I'm going to go through the results of these as well. But also there's something to say about why these questions were asked in the first place. If Christianity were primarily about the truth that there is in fact a God, that the Christian God is real, that the Bible is the Christian God's inspired instructions for humanity, most of the things that people listed as reasons for their leaving shouldn't matter. It shouldn't be relevant. If the Bible says if a man lies with another man as he lies with a woman, they've committed an abomination and they're deserving of death, then that's what the Bible says. Now the question becomes, does that reflect the mind of God, and how could we know that? There were people in the study who were like, pointing out that the first thing I noticed was what Christians preach and practice didn't seem to align with what I knew to be the character of God. This is a quote from someone. The first thing was noticing how what Christians preached and practiced didn't seem to align with that I knew to be the character of God. How do you know what the character of God is? If you're not going to the Bible and you can't point to God actually revealing this information to you, or why somebody should care about a personal revelation to you, what's really going on here? And they continued, that same person continued, including views on the LGBT community, immigration, adoption, mental health issues, mission work, and just general treatment of others. So what this individual is saying is they had a view of what God's character is like and what God would think about these things. And the church or the denomination that they're involved with didn't line up with what they knew to be the character of God. No discussion about, there's been no example in the entire history of the world of anyone being able to demonstrate conclusively what the character of God is. There's just been a bunch of people claiming stuff. The Bible is just a bunch of people claiming stuff about God. God hasn't shown up to confirm anything. But what we're seeing is that people have a view of what they think God's character is, and this church is in agreement with it. So when people were asked, what's gained in your new framework? So you've left Christianity of type X, and now you're involved in something else. What's gained? Well, number one was freedom at like 36%. Second one was love and acceptance of others. Now, you could look at this right off the bat and say, ooh, hey, these are the Christians that were caring about love first. And so they gained this love. And I think you're right. But freedom was number one. Love and acceptance of others was number two. Removal of guilt and shame is 26. And of course, the stalwart evangelicals are going to say, well, that's just it. Y'all just want to sin. I have a video about y'all just want to sin. Go ahead and sin. Sin's a bullshit concept to begin with. But the removal of guilt and shame is there. You don't get to trivialize that. And while it may have nothing to do with the truth of Christianity, it's something that definitely has to do with the truth about humans and who we are. After that was ambiguity and openness and curiosity, self-acceptance and love, self-determination, intellectual integrity, joy and peace, LGBTQ affirmation, no fear of an afterlife, and you gained something that aligns with your morals and values. And 4% or so feel like they gained community. That's where the secular community probably has to do a lot more work, because gaining community should be much, much higher, considering that when we look at the list of things that were lost, community is going to come in at the top. But appreciating and respect of other people, connections to nature, appreciation of body, sex, and emotions, health, women's rights. Nobody gives a crap about women's rights. Still 3 point, or they didn't gain any. I guess this isn't about what they cared about, but they didn't gain this. So doing it for women's rights wasn't something that they gained. Presentness, social justice, and political alignment. So for all the people who are like, oh, hey, Trump played a big issue in this, political alignment did not. And it's not clear that their political alignment in any way changed. So what we're probably looking at is liberal Christians who are queer friendly, who are not going to be dogmatic and judgmental. They are not sinners in the hands of an angry God sort of Christians. And so the sinners in the hands of an angry God sort of Christians get to look at these and say, this is the gay friendly churches that don't, they don't follow the Bible. They're not real Christians. They get to do that. And they did. Even in responses to this article, there were a number of positions similar to that expressed, where God's given them over to reprobate minds, or, in there was a passage from Jude that says, Jude 1:17 and 19, but you, beloved, remember what was foretold by the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ when they said to you, in the last times there will be scoffers who will follow their own ungodly desires. Now, what they're gaining here is freedom, love, acceptance, queer support, removal of guilt, removal of fear of hell, joy and peace. All those things are gained. And that is going to be portrayed as them being given over to their ungodly desires. But when asked what's missing in their current framework, so they've left Christianity, and now what's missing? Community. 66, 67%. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying this is in any way a failing of the secular community. We are at a distinct disadvantage. Religious organizations hold a privileged position in the United States. They have a tax-exempt status that isn't necessarily available to every other community. They have the entire history of the United States with this privileged position. Churches on countless street corners around town, the majority of people are involved, and an incentive to participate with the church and to benefit from the church. Community is perhaps one of the most human aspects that religions co-opted to bolster themselves. And if you build a community that's surrounded around a particular church, when you leave that church, you are likely to leave the community, even if it's not one that engages in the sort of shunning or ostracizing members the way, like LDS or J-Dubs or whatever would do. So community was number one of what they're missing in their new community, in their new framework. Number two was music and the arts. Number three was certainty on something that isn't defined, but so maybe just general certainty. 6% said that nothing was missing. 6% had that family was missing. 6% missed free food. So free food and family are on a par with, hey, what's missing? I miss the food. I miss going to the building. I miss hearing the music. You know what's not up there at the top? Truth, God, Jesus. None of those things are up there near the top. Certainty about an afterlife comes next, and certainty that all will work out. The various events, connection to the divine, there you go, 4%. Now, that might be because some of those people who left a religious community no longer felt a need for those sorts of things, and so they don't feel that they're missing it. It might also be because some of them, significantly smaller portion, left and probably joined some other community or found community in some other place. Maybe they joined Sunday Assembly or Oasis. Maybe they found a local secular community that they can interact with. Maybe they went to a couple atheist conventions. Maybe they're just able to hang out and do things like go to their knitting club or go play Frisbee golf, but not have it be church associated. Now you just find a different group of people to hang out with. And maybe they'll become disillusioned and disappointed with those other frameworks and those other groups as well later on. But what's lost by leaving? Nobody seemed to care that much about volunteering, less than 1%, despite the fact that's one of the things that secular communities often get hammered for. We don't volunteer as much or donate as much as, for example, religious groups do. And it's because of the privileged position of religions. You have a framework where you get to hide all of your money, you get to hide all of your value, you don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to report anything to anybody, and you have an incentive for people to give 10% or 20% of their income directly to you without any showing where the money's going and who's benefiting from it. And so people consider themselves charitable when they just run in on Sunday and, I put $10 in the offering plate. Well, what's that $10 going to? Just making sure the church is there for you next week. It's not charity, but there are wonderful charities. There are wonderful hospitals. There are wonderful places of higher education that were all started by people through their churches, because churches have this privileged position to be able to do some of that. So what's the takeaway from this particular study? First of all, as a reminder, not a scientific random sample. We have a social media study that was conducted by a gay ex-pastor. So the sampling is likely to be very biased. I would be interested to see if these same questions were posed in to people in a much more standardized, representative, random sample. But what I will say is that the results of this stack with what we've seen and what we've heard from people finding their way out of religion. As somebody who's been involved with this for decades now, feels weird saying that, and has heard from hundreds, if not thousands of people who found their way free of religion or changed their views or became more skeptical or identified more as a humanist. These are the things that we've been hearing. These are the things that have shown up in religious studies over and over again, that the one thing the secular community lacks is the same sense of community or a similar sense of community that they had in their church. Matter of fact, I think Teresa McBain, who showed up at the Reason rally to announce, hey, I'm an atheist, and then after, having some ethical issues with her resume, eventually went back to saying, yeah, I'm not an atheist. And one of the reasons that she gave was she missed the music. And I'm pretty sure she would say, although I can't speak for her, that she missed the community as well. I think those things kind of went hand in hand for her and others. But it wasn't about the truth of religion. Ayaan Hirsi Ali recently became a Christian, or claims to be a Christian, not because of any evidence for the truth of the claims of Christianity, not because she became convinced that there is a God, that Jesus Christ was God in human form, who came down and died for the repentance of sin and was resurrected and ascended bodily into heaven. None of those things exist in what Ayaan was talking about. It is entirely about whether or not the Christian club was beneficial for her to join, based on the things that she was missing, some sort of explanation that would beat back the nihilistic views in her head, or with regard to some sort of motivated goal, which is standing up against wokeness and ending Islamism. And Christianity is a better ally against Islamism than atheism is. Cool. Thank you for admitting that it's not about truth. Thank you. Politics makes strange bedfellows. People tend to view their Christianity, their religion, as a club. It's a beneficial social community of largely like-minded people. Whether or not there is a God or evidence for it scarcely matters. What the Bible actually says scarcely matters. These things are at best secondary for a lot of people. If you thought there was a God who was the source of morality and the judge that you would have to face for eternity, and you thought that God was against something, and you intentionally sided with that thing that the God finds immoral, that'd be, that's bravado. But dismissing your former church as, that's not what I know God to be like, tells us a lot. It says that you have some concept of God for which you can offer no warrant. This is just what you feel God thinks. And the church is no longer in line with what you feel God thinks. We moved around a lot as a kid, every 4 or 5 years, and we would end up at whatever Southern Baptist Convention church was both closest to our house and agreed with what my mom thought. That's how we picked churches, or that's how my parents picked churches. It's wild to look back and think of it now, but it needed to be this very narrow, fundamentalist, evangelical, Bible first, no drinking, no dancing, although those things kind of wavered depending on which church you were going to. But there was never a thought of dismissing a church because that's not what I think God's like. There was, though, a thought of dismissing a church because I know they are ungodly, which is exactly the same thing. Every single instance of somebody saying, hey, you're not a true Christian, is your version of Christianity doesn't agree with my version of Christianity. And the best we can ever do in those fights, not we, because I'm no longer in that group, but the best any of them can ever do in those fights is to pull out the Bible. Because let God be true and every man a liar. And so we're going to go to the Bible and say, what does the Bible say? Well, the Bible is clearly against male-male sex. And so if your church is not against that, then you're not biblical. Ah, yes, but It calls us to love. And Jesus hung around with prostitutes, and prostitution's a sin. So Jesus is showing us how to be better. So we should hang around with our gay friends. Yeah, but this started with people not being able to go to their gay friends' weddings and things like that. There was nothing about Jesus saying, hey, we should support prostitutes doing prostitution. I would have applauded if he said something like that, but he didn't. And so Christians are going to constantly argue over who is or isn't a true Christian, and they have no leg to stand on because there's no demonstration of any God ever saying anything to anyone about what that actually thinks. So the good news from out of this study, first, empathy and decency towards the LGBTQ community is on the rise. And I suspect that that is one of the reasons why there has been such a targeted attack on the trans community, why everything we're seeing everywhere, all over the news, trans this, gay this, gay. This is the enemy of the church. And it's not that the LGBTQ community is the enemy of the church. It is people loving and caring for and being compassionate towards the LGBTQ community, being accepting towards. Because fundamentalist literalists who are going to view the Bible as being completely opposed to homosexuality, trans rights, and things like that, there will not be acceptance from them of people who are loving and compassionate towards the LGBTQ community. You can be not awful to them and just say, hey, you guys are free to do your stuff, but I'm not going to go to your wedding. I'm not going to sanction your marriage. I'm not going to pretend like you're equal. I'm not going to cave into your delusions or whatever else. And they are, in most cases, on very strong biblical footing. This is what I pointed out with Westboro Baptist Church. You can complain all you want about Westboro Baptist Church. By and large, they are in accordance with a plain text reading of what the Bible says. And the best you can ever do is say, well, Jesus said and did these things, and this other part of the book says these, so how do we resolve that? And Westboro is going to be on better footing than either, and they say, we're going to follow what the book says for us to do, and to not be united with those people, and let God deal with it afterwards. When the Bible says that if a man lies with another man, he's committed an abomination and is deserving of death, there's two things you can hear from two different camps. But very few people are going to be saying, although there are some that say this means we are required to kill or execute people from, engaged in gay sex. What they'll say instead is, this is God saying this is an abomination and talks about how awful and sinful it is, and we should, turn away from it. Doesn't say you need to kill them, just says they're deserving of death, and we'll let God sort it out. Then there's the other group that says, hang on, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We are all reprobates. We are all sinners. We are all deserving of death. None of us deserve salvation. Salvation is a gift of God. And if he's going to give it to me after being a terrible liar, and if he's going to give it to Jim Bob after being a drunken adulterer, then he might give it to Susan for being a lesbian, or despite being a lesbian. And so this is where the fight comes down to, with which parts of the Bible are we going to use, are they going to use, I'm not part of their we, to prioritize how they treat and interact with people. The good news is gay-friendly churches aren't biblical. They're better than that. The good news is people are leaving the more bigoted churches for whatever the reason. That part isn't part of this social media survey. That part is the fact. Decline in church association, in particular, churches that are more evangelical, more literalist, more fundamentalist, more opposed to LGBTQ rights and freedoms and liberties. People are leaving. Whatever the reason is, it's there. The good news is this is in part a reaction to Trump-vangelical MAGA positions. The good news is people are prioritizing love and decency over liturgy and dogma. But there's bad news too. The bad news is this isn't about truth or about a God or a doctrine. It's about whether or not those doctrines feel right. Weirdly, only 4.7% listed abuse and hiding abuse as their final reason. So pointing out child sexual abuse scandals may not have nearly the impact that it really ought to. These are lives that are destroyed and churches that are hiding the perpetrators from justice. This isn't the Salem witch trials. This is now. This has been going on for decades and is only one of the many things that churches have done. But for only 4.7% of the people listed that. Now, it's worth noting that the reasons listed might be early responses from new deconverts. It may be more about their emotional reaction to leaving, and some later study looking at people who have left or changed their denomination in 5 years or 10 years might find other reasons. That'd be nice. I can't say it's true. But these early responses don't focus on truth or evidence or conflict with scientific findings. Evolution doesn't make this list anywhere. That doesn't mean we need to stop worrying about logical arguments, evidence, and skepticism, because those things are the strong foundation that allows us to also point out the apparent injustices towards the LGBTQIA community and women and hypocrisy within the church. It is so that when people find their way out, they have a good place to land, even if they didn't realize it while they were on their way out. People deconstructing may deconstruct for purely emotional reasons, but they'll need a firm foundation and they will need community. We do need folks in the broader secular community providing the intellectual foundation, and we need folks providing the community as a landing spot. We need people to be able to say, hey, I didn't leave Christianity because there was a dearth of evidence for its truth, but it's comforting to know that not only is that the case, but it explains why Christianity fails to maintain appeal in the modern world. In our search for truth and a better world, Christianity lags behind because it doesn't care about a better world here on earth. Its focus is on an afterlife. The people who thought, wrongly, that Christianity was all about love and acceptance of everyone, they're finally seeing that this simply isn't the case. A judgmental God, invented by and supported by a zealous few who wish to marginalize others and exalt themselves and enrich themselves in some cases, that's the true foundation, and the rest is window dressing. So thanks, Brandon, for doing the study and posting about it. It'll be interesting to see if other studies ask similar questions, because this one focused all about, hey, what are the benefits? What didn't you like about Christianity? What got better when you left it? What are you missing? Nothing at all about what's true. Nothing at all about the truth of a God or the truth of a doctrine. It's all about, I don't feel that my church represents the God I know, so I'm ditching it, which is commendable when you're ditching it for something better, and confusing because you care about something better or something you think is better more than you care about what's actually true. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.